Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to the PwC second annual ESG Week. My name is Kevin Cambridge, and I'm the ESG partner and ESG coordinator for the Caribbean region. And I have the pleasure of serving as moderator both for today's session and the sessions for the remainder of the week, which I'll recap at the end. A year ago, or roughly a year ago, we kicked off our inaugural ESG Week. And it was an opportunity for PwC to demonstrate not only our capabilities, but to also allow for upskilling both with PwC and the broader community and the world. This year, I'm happy to say that this is the second installment of ESG Week. And this year, we also have a power-packed and very deep bench for us to display not only what we've done over the last year, but to heighten awareness as to what's being transformed and what's transforming the ESG landscape. With me today are two of my colleagues, Ronell Hawthorne-Boyd and Hayden Ward, who will be assisting with the panel and be participating. Over the last year, PwC would have generated a 2023 ESG corporate governance survey. That survey allowed us, for lack of a better phrase, to get a bit of an understanding of the voice of the customer. What we intend to do with this session is look at regulatory governance, the investment agenda, and ESG and regulation. Stakeholders, including investors, use annual financial and sustainability reporting to understand the organizations and how they impact sustainability, risks, and opportunities. What we intend to do today is to bring a very tight discussion in place that will really take a look and have a deep dive as it relates to us capitalizing on discussions happening at this time. The timing of this session is right at the heels of COP28, and that's quite intentional. In this session, we intend to really explore and deep dive into some of the topics that are being discussed during COP28 as well. When we look at our speakers this afternoon, we have Ronell Hawthorne-Boyd and Hayden Ward. Ronell is a partner of PwC Eastern Caribbean firm based in Barbados. She is the environmental social governance leader for Eastern Caribbean firm and tax and legal services leader for the Caribbean region. She is an attorney at law, a fellow of the Institute of Chartered Secretaries of Canada, and holds a LLM Masters in Corporate and Commercial Law with an emphasis on corporate governance. Welcome, Ronell. Hayden Ward is an agile financial services professional with over a decade of experience at PwC. He brings deep ESG reporting and assurance experience along with his digital acumen to help clients foster innovative solutions for sustainability reporting and refining their ESG disclosures to meet investor-grade standards. As a thought leader at PwC, Hayden actively contributes to the firm's intellectual capital around ESG disclosure expectations, navigating the complexities of multiple reporting requirements, addressing greenwashing and sustainable finance. Welcome, Hayden. And I must say for the record that both Hayden and Ronell are no strangers to myself. So we're hoping to capitalize on those relationships as we progress the panel. And I think for the sake of the panel, I'm going to come out of the gate with addressing the elephant in the room, which is COP28, which begins this week. And PwC will be there for the hopes of helping to advance meaningful actions to address climate and nature crisis. What are your thoughts, Ronell and Hayden, on this year's COP, and what do you hope to see coming out of it?
Shall I jump in first, Hayden?
Sure.
Well, good morning, Kevin. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here for our second ESG week. Really looking forward to everything to unfold during our discussions this week. So Kevin has asked us to start with touching on COP28, really pivotal time. A lot of expectations coming out of this week. COP28 is really meant to focus on some key priorities. And I don't think that those priorities, those are the same things, obviously, that I think all of us want to see successfully be dealt with at COP28. First of all, I think it's the elephant in the room, the fast tracking of the energy transition and slashing of emissions before 2030 that we all need to see happen for our planet to survive. The other big ticket item from my perspective is transforming climate finance by delivering on promises that have been made, old promises, and setting the framework, to figure out how to deal with the deal on climate finance. It all sounds really good, but 2023, I think we've all felt the heat, literally. It's on track to be the warmest year on record. So we're really far behind in our climate goals, and it really is quite a scary scenario right now. COP28 is being described as the implementation COP. So from my perspective, that is what I would like to see. More implementation, urgent implementation, and less talk, because the conclusions and the action items coming out of COP28, they really have to be used to figure out what is the roadmap to accelerate climate action. We simply cannot continue going the way we're going. It really is now or never. And it's also the time, I think, that we have to set the stage for operationalizing the loss and damage fund to help our Caribbean countries and many other countries in the world that continue to suffer what is really irreversible climate-driven damage. So it's to see real action come out of COP28. The agreement reached at the final meeting of the Transitional Committee in Abu Dhabi early this month has me a bit nervous, because certainly the feedback coming out of that session is that the agreement can be described as somewhat fragile. So we really do have to go into the sessions this week hoping that there is a determination to really make these things a reality, and that there's a much greater sense of urgency. So really, Kevin, from my perspective as a Caribbean woman, as a mother who wants to see my children and grandchildren be able to have a planet to survive on, we can just only pray that we see results coming out of these two fundamental areas coming out of COP28 this week.
Yes, Ronald, I would echo all of those comments. I think also, considering our position in the Caribbean region, we are actually a lot more impacted and aware of some of the, how climate change actually, changes our lives. I remember surfing in Barbados in places that had waves that no longer have waves. I remember when the beaches never had sargassum seaweed, and every year is another hurricane season. So as it relates to COP28, I think it's really enforcing that at the global level. And the key takeaway for me, again, is more engagement with our key stakeholders and business partners on the engagement versus divestment agenda.
Thanks for that, Hayden. And I just want to pivot from Ronell's statement of us feeling the heat, and I'll pivot right into climate. So in terms of climate action, which requires a democratic restructuring of approach to the issues, in other words, we're not going from oil barons to solar barons. Given this premise, how should governments and industries and businesses approach this, in your view?
Sorry, Kevin, you wanted me to respond first, or Hayden? I'm going to jump in.
Hayden, I'll ping it over to you.
Sure. So, in Canada, one thing that we've seen a lot is it's really a stakeholder and market-driven, initiative. We have protests downtown in Toronto and around the city every other week, if not every week. So what we're seeing is really regulatory action is being accelerated here to match the global agenda, mirroring the discussions at COP28 later this week. We've seen alliances being formed, particularly within certain industries, and that's helping shape more consistent, comparable, and higher quality reporting through, metrics that are more relate to material topics, risks, and opportunities in the business. I think one of the things that we are seeing move very quickly is sustainable financing projects here in Toronto, and linking sustainability factors to the cost of capital within the organization. Procurement policies are changing rapidly, and it's kind of at the point now where you have no choice but to get on board. So lots of movement.
And anything in your neck of the woods, Ronell? Your perspective?
Yeah, I think a lot of the stakeholder-driven activities that Hayden just mentioned are the things that are going to again drive a lot of the discussion in Dubai this week. And I think coming out of that, this is really going to impact on the global business community. And we're in the Caribbean, we're no different. Because I think we're sort of at a crossroads, because the decisions taken this week, those are very likely to continue to influence and maybe pick up the pace in influencing regulatory frameworks and policy commitments that are going to be made, and stakeholder expectations as well. So businesses are really going to be forced now, if they haven't already, to sort of realign their strategies with climate objectives. And in doing that, they have to be pragmatic, but optimistic, but we have to set some ambitious goals moving forward. And certainly our Caribbean enterprises are not largely made up of oil barons, but I think we have a fundamental role to play as well, because when our leaders went to COP27 and when they go back to 28 now, lobbying for our economic rights and demanding that the L&D fund actually be given life and start to have a positive impact, I think it's important for them to do so, still demonstrating that although we have the least impact on our environment in the grand scheme of things, we're still doing our part. I think it's important for them to be able to demonstrate that our business leaders understand, and that however small a positive impact we can have, it is still a positive impact that we take seriously.
My only contribution to that really is all of the points you've raised, or the absence of the points you raise, are obviously barriers to progress, and it's all needed. And they're all highlighted as well when I look at our 2023 PwC Network Environment Report. I'm going to just do a quick pivot, Hayden, and direct this question to you. As we all know, the landscape is shifting from a sort of voluntary to a more mandatory environment in terms of reporting. From your perspective, and you're looking at regulation and reporting, it's often perceived as burdensome, and in particular organizations where there's a compliance mentality. However, in other organizations, there is a trust mentality where there's a realization that compliance on its own is not sufficient to help an organization thrive. Can you talk a little and give your perspective as to why it's meaningful, and perhaps shift the mindset away from compliance thinking towards trust as a catalyst to transform growth?
Yeah, it is a really important transition that we're seeing now. Again, in Toronto, like, our reporting is predominantly voluntary at this point. And what's really happening is we're now seeing an uptick where regulation is on the horizon, and our clients are now like, oh no, what am I going to do? Taking the compliance lens, if I think about the insurance industry, many of my clients are still navigating IFRS 17. So they're actually finding themselves at a disadvantage where they haven't had the internal capacity to now transition towards what is going to be the new climate disclosure rules. So they're now a bit behind comparatively to other organizations who have taken a more long-term view and recognize how sustainability not only impacts their community, their stakeholders, their internal resourcing and talent, but it is also a long-term driver for their business, where you can navigate what are the material topics, how are they impacting our community. I think some of the better examples we've seen here in Canada was we had a science-based review of what the impacts of catastrophic weather events could be on the Toronto waterfront community. And that was a project that then directed financing towards fortifying certain areas. And, we are only privileged that, aside from the winter, we don't really face many natural disasters or challenges. But again, bringing it back to the Caribbean region, that's something that, is really, really important. And as we work through navigating how some of the key players in the region can help contribute to sustainability agenda more broadly, I think that's going to be super important and going to have some far-reaching impacts. I know in Jamaica, we've had discussions where they're collaborating with the central bank. And similarly in Trinidad, they've been leveraging those relationships to finance some sustainable housing projects. I know in Bahamas that they're working on the seagrass and how they can use that for carbon capture. And I think, it's only going to continue to promote product innovation, especially in your region where, I think it's just so much more relevant for us. So as we change from that compliance, it's actually changing back to the compliance mentality is how I would word it. So the people who, pioneered their ESG reporting strategy, they're just that many steps ahead of everyone else in terms of building that cross-functional team to be able to actually bring the strategy and the story to life.
Thanks for that contribution. Ronald, I'll pivot to you. When you look at PwC, and particularly in the region, there was a 2022 corporate governance and ESG report. I know you had a major role, and I congratulate you for your efforts on that report. In looking at the report, it was quite a differentiator in many respects from my vantage point. One, it gave definitely a consolidated view as to sort of where the Caribbean region was on the spectrum in terms of ESG. But even more important, I think, to me, it was the differentiator, I think, for the report was that it was segmented. And it gave you a bird's eye view on various islands in the Caribbean of exactly where they were on that spectrum.
Yeah.
From your vantage point, and I asked you this question because I know you led a lot of the work on that report, looking at organizations in the region, in your view, looking at the corporate governance survey and looking at some of those statistics, one of them that stood out was that 60% of the directors surveyed said that even though ESG was on the agenda, less than a third of them indicated along the lines of it being a recurring agenda item. Notwithstanding less than 1/3 of the ESG matters were a regular part of the agenda, what does this tell you about where we are and in terms of regional boards on the spectrum of compliance and trust?
Yeah, thanks for that, Kevin. I mean, we found that work to be really inspiring and gave us so much information about where we are in the region and what work we need to do. I think in respect of that specific question that we posed across the region, I think what it said to us is that although the seed has been planted, the discussions are happening, ESG is still, to a large extent, viewed more as a burden and not as an opportunity. And I think we have a long ways to go, especially because our Pulse survey that we've done this quarter, the results of which we are working on feverishly and will release shortly, seem to indicate that there hasn't been too much of a shift in that particular area between our last survey and this one. So my hope, though, is that the new reporting requirements that we're seeing coming out, that our regional entities will, in the medium term, be very much exposed to and subject to, because of these businesses will be more exposed, the questions will have to be asked. This will have to form part of board agendas. This will have to be a major discussion, because reporting is one thing, but having something to report is another. So that may force a discussion and drive the reality that our boards have to face, that their stakeholders are no longer just their shareholders, that stakeholders in the form of our environment and our society must be taken into consideration because they too provide a form of capital to our organizations. And my hope then is that all of this will culminate. The fact that we have to report and you want to have something to report will force a discussion that comes to the realization of how important ESG is in driving long-term sustainability. So I'm hoping we'll see some traction.
Yes, thank you. And I think too, and I don't want to steal any thunder, but I know that in train right now is a Pulse survey for 2023. So I'm very eager to see exactly where sort of that spectrum has shifted. Did it remain the same? Did things go left or right? So that'll be interesting.
For sure. So far, this particular point of how much our boards are discussing ESG does not appear to have shifted too much. But as I said, we are going through the process now of a very detailed review. So we're going to be excited to share those results shortly.
I won't touch that topic anymore. We'll eagerly anticipate the release of that report. Ronelle, just sticking with you. In December 2022, the EU's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD, was published. With implications for some 50,000 businesses and listed in the EU or significant operations there, regardless of where they were based. And it requires them to report more about sustainability performance and any other piece of regulation to date, beginning with 2024 fiscal year in some cases. How do you see that impacting businesses in the region?
Well, a lot of these global regulations, I think our regional enterprises may not necessarily be taking any of this into consideration yet. And I think we really do. It's a good question, Kevin, because I think we really do need to think this through. The CSRD itself doesn't provide the details on how EU disclosure is going to work. That takes the form of the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, ESRS, all the acronyms. So ESRS standards that support CSRD regulations, these are extremely granular. It's a very detailed list of requirements under the CSRD. And I think it's being said, and I tend to agree, that compared to other voluntary sustainability frameworks, it's considered to be, in terms of both its mandatory and voluntary instructions, the most detailed. And it includes the fact that those companies captured under those regulations are required to collect information about both their upstream and their downstream value chains. So I think it's inevitable that some of our Caribbean enterprises who have dealings in the EU will be captured, and they will need to report at some stage as part of EU value chains. So we have to think that through. Our enterprises need to consider whether suppliers or vendors, customers in their value chain are captured by CSRD. And whether they at some point will have to make those disclosures. And again, I go back to the fact that having to make disclosures, whether it's under CSRD or IFRS S1 and S2, or whatever it is, you want to actually have something to disclose that's positive. So disclosures are one thing, but getting to the point of our boards and our C-suites understanding the benefits to be derived, and as such wanting to have something positive to report because they understand the positive impact on their long-term sustainability. I'm hoping that all of this will help to drive those discussions and drive action.
Yes. Thank you, Ronelle. And it's a perfect segue to my next question, which I'll pose to Hayden. In terms of the raft of regulations already at play or coming into play, how would companies approach, or how should they approach and assess their readiness for what is to come? If they're to begin today, what should they be looking at? Or where should they start?
Yeah, well, I'm gonna start by sharing a small joke from my boss, Mr. Scott Morrison, that the first journal entry was posted over 500 years ago. And if you think about the journey that we've been on today to the SOX world and PCAOB quality, for public reporting, it's definitely not something that happens overnight. Building on Ronelle's CSRD topic briefly, the first thing you need to do is a legal entity mapping, because many of our clients may just have a small desk out in Luxembourg for tax purposes that didn't even realize that they would be captured by the legal requirements. As she suggested, the ESRS are far more expansive. IFRS S1 and S2 is, the first thematic standard is S2 on climate, whereas the ESRS have 14 various topics covering all the E, S, and G. So a shameless plug towards our PwC Canada 2024 reporting insights that have just been released. Anyone on the call, I'd encourage you to just Google PwC reporting insights right now. We've released a framework for building trusted ESG reporting, and it's really a passion project that our team is quite proud of, as we've had our staff reviewing the top 250 public and private companies' sustainability reporting in Canada. And there's 4 key steps that we've laid out with key action items that I think is a great reference guide. The first one is developing your ESG strategy. And that really takes into account the materiality assessment and your stakeholder engagement. And that helps you identify what the material topics for your business are and the material risks and opportunities. We are lucky that when we get to the second stage of selecting standards and metrics, that we actually get to apply a financial materiality, as I'm expecting that the international sustainability reporting standards are what going to apply in the Caribbean region. Whereas, if you're captured by some of the CSRD, ESRS, you've also got to take a double materiality point of view. So develop your strategy, select the standards and metrics. The next step is actually where you now take your business process and start to move towards a financial reporting lens of quality for your non-financial reporting information. So, business process controls and governance is a really key area that we see a lot of time being spent now, where companies are now trying to move towards that final stage of publishing investor-grade ESG reporting. So, I've seen a lot of our clients apply more of an art than a science, where, well, my friend is publishing a sustainability report on their carbon footprint related to their investment portfolio. Sure, I guess that's where I should start. And I think that is going to help enable the process and get the ball rolling. But while covering you in the short term, I think as we navigate to the medium and long term horizons, it really needs to work towards more of those science-based targets and ensuring that we're on the right trajectory to meeting some of our key goals. So I think shameless plug, I would take a look at that, and then as you navigate the journey, reach out to Kevin and Ronell.
Thank you very much, Aidan. I don't find that plug shameless at all. I just want to take care of an administrative point. To the attendees, you do have the ability to ask questions using the question tab below the video, so feel free. Ronell, I'll just pivot to you, and from the perspective of as companies try to wrap their heads around incorporating ESG and sustainability in their business practices and all that it implies, how do they get a handle on where to begin and what to prioritize?
Well, I think as Hayden just said, it takes a lot. It takes some planning. It takes some determination and some planning. I think it starts with our boards and our leadership teams, though, acknowledging what it takes to drive that long-term sustainable value in an environment where stakeholders are really now demanding that our companies do good while they're doing well. It's not enough to do well. There's the need to acknowledge that there are stakeholders who contribute different forms of capital to your success. You take from the environment, you take from our society, and those stakeholders need to be taken into consideration. So from my perspective, always goes back to the governance. Governance has to drive the E and the S. Boards need to remember that although much of the focus is on the urgent need to save the planet, ESG is a wider discussion. It looks and forces us to think hard about our communities and how we can have a positive impact. So it's climate change, it's community, it's wider stakeholder support. It's starting with thinking those things through, Kevin, I think is the right place, again, to start. Our leaders need to understand their baseline, then set goals and targets. And then the work starts to take decisive action, disclosing, communicating, and ultimately reporting on where we are currently in terms of the current state, determining what the measurable future goals are will be fundamental to success. Those goals need to be measurable. We need to be able to hold ourselves accountable. so that, again, we actually have something positive to report as we move forward. I think that's the approach that I think will work for us in the region, given our state of evolution.
I often use the old consulting adage, it's finding out where you are in terms of your as is, determining where you want to be in terms of your to be structure, and that piece in the middle is your gap that needs to be focused on. So thank you both for that contribution. Hayden, I mentioned at the onset that the COP28 was the elephant in the room. I think there are two elephants. So earlier this year, International Sustainability Standards Board, ISSB, finalized their two exposure drafts. They actually finalized S1, S2. Could you speak to both S1, S2 in terms of just in a general sense, what they mean, what they require, and how did our lives change on the 26th of June, 2023?
Well, it's a great question because I think it's also going to be very relevant to the Caribbean region. So Ronald made a quick connection point to what we refer to as the alphabet soup in ESG reporting, acronyms on acronyms. And what S1 and S2 have really helped is to develop an international sustainability reporting standard that we can now start to drive better consistency within this journey. So S1, leverages the 4 pillars of what we used to refer to as the TCFD framework, Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. That forms the basis of actually many of the upcoming regulations and ESG reporting standards. So that's a big win. They've actually taken over monitoring of the implementation of the TCFD guidance. So S1 is really covering those 4 pillars and how you approach sustainability more generally. S2 really brings it back to the climate theme. It's the first thematic standard. And as we navigate what those material risks and opportunities are to the business, it's now going to be incorporating it into your climate scenario analysis and then quantifying what the financial impacts on your business and enterprise value may be. That's going to take a bit more effort because it now starts to draw on some of the more technical risk management and modeling details of the organization. But I think the good news here is that there is a phased approach that is going to be applied. So, in the Caribbean region, you have the benefit of looking at some of the head office, units who are already reporting on a global level. Some of the teams in the region are already submitting, ESG information that is being consolidated in the report. I think that's great because it allows us to draw reference from, what is publicly available disclosures. And we've been having a number of conversations with some of the ESG leaders and representatives in the Caribbean. And I think one other great thing is that the institutes have already started to collaborate on what the ISSB is and going to mean for the Caribbean region. So I would stay close to, it's the ICAC, the Institute of the Chartered Accountants of the Caribbean, who is, bringing key inputs from each of the specific countries' institutes to the table. And then I think that's going to help navigate what the reporting landscape is going to look like in the Caribbean. And again, it's not going to impact everyone at the same time. There are going to be some key players and some larger organizations that will have to hit the ground running first. And everybody else has the benefit of learning from those disclosures and then using it to their advantage. Another thing I might add on to that, just connecting with Ronell again, is the real key principle of ESG reporting is actually transparency. And one of the factors that may be a challenge in the Caribbean region that some of our clients are experiencing is they currently may not be able to disclose that positive, that message. And this is where we get into the risk of greenwashing, that, the another important reason why you need to take action now is before you get to a state where your ESG reporting becomes mandatory, you actually have timeline
something to report.
to put some effort into action.
Yeah.
And I think the easiest connection here could simply be diversity and inclusion, where even in Toronto, some of our clients just don't have a very positive story to share, and that's also been hindering some of the progress. But the reality is that they are running out of time.
No, very good points. Actually, to double down on something you mentioned earlier with respect to particularly ICAC, I actually had the opportunity to attend the 40th annual ICAC convention this year in Grenada. And realistically, I would say that the lion's share of the presentations, and I did have the opportunity to present, but a lion's share of them spoke to the changing landscape from a regulatory perspective. Because once again, if you look back at last year's ESG week, a lot of it was just saying, what was to come, looking at a crystal ball. Now we do have these stakes in the ground that we can pivot from and better prepare ourselves, our clients, and other stakeholders.
Yeah.
For companies attending this webinar, what are 3 key points that you would want them to maybe take away from today's session? So if you say, forget everything you heard, there's 3 things I want you to focus on. And I'll pose this to both yourself, Ronelle, and Hayden. What would be 3 points that you would say are sort of what I would say maybe they're key learning points that should be taken away from the session today?
Oh, well, I mean, I think we've touched on them all. I think the first one from my perspective is that environmental, social, and governance issues are fundamental to long-term sustainable value creation. Is it easy? Are these things easy to address and easy to make part of our strategy for the medium and the long-term sustainability and growth of our enterprises? Not always, because although our stakeholders, some of our stakeholders being our investors, want to see us doing good while doing well, they don't always want to see fewer dividends. But the fact remains that that balance has to be struck and the drive has to be there to see ESG as an opportunity and not as a chore, because to do otherwise will be to the detriment of an institution. I think the second thing is that pivoting from that, stakeholders are really not going to tolerate a lack of acknowledgement and action. Younger generations especially have very little or no tolerance for enterprises that they see as not doing right by the society and right by the environment. And these are your future customers. These are your future, this is a talent pool from which you'll want to draw as they exit university. And they do not have a level of tolerance for companies that are not doing the right thing. And then I think the third thing is that reporting on sustainability is really now a reality. And action is needed to not just to be able to report, but to have something positive to report. And again, to steer clear of greenwashing and to ensure that, yes, governance matters that are helping to drive things in the right direction, like diversity and inclusion, like ensuring that the right skill sets exist on your boards, that all of these things are in place to really have the ability to walk the talk, to have something positive to report and to be prepared to report. And it's not going to happen overnight. We have to be able to report where we are, depending on how quickly, I mean, going back to Hayden's point regarding IFRS and S1 and S2, my understanding is that each of our regional accounting bodies have acknowledged and the adoption of S1 and S2 come January. Now implementation is going to happen. It's not going to happen overnight, but it is going to happen. So there is some time to ensure that we understand where our baseline is and that we are in a position to report that, but that we are also able to report what the plan is moving forward. We have to take active steps in that direction. So that would be the third point I think I would make, Kevin.
Thank you, Ronelle. Hayden, your perspective?
Yeah, building on what we've shared, I would just reiterate the need to start. Like another shameless plug, I think the framework for building trusted ESG reporting we've released is a great guideline. And what that will help organizations do is come up with a roadmap. To Ronelle's point, that roadmap is probably going to be, at a minimum, 1 to 2 years, but more likely than not, 3 to 5 years, especially in the region, considering the phased reporting approach. The second thing I would say is we need to get comfortable that we're not all going to get it right. There are going to be evolutions in data quality and availability, and further guidance being released on quantifying some of these metrics. So while we are making our best efforts to get the ball rolling, publish reliable and credible disclosures, we are seeing restatements start to happen along the way as we get some of those improvements. So need to get comfortable with that process. And then, I think looking at the questions in the chat, we've touched on how legislation in the Caribbean region, is likely to unravel with the collaboration of the institutes. So keeping a pulse on that, I think, is definitely also going to be important, because it is going to start with some of the, larger public organizations and public interest entities that are going to have to be reporting sooner than, other private organizations. So I think that's the summary. Start today. In the Caribbean, I noticed we're celebrating ESG week. In Toronto, we were just celebrating ESG month. And I would like to suggest that 2024 is going to be ESG year.